Right or right.
Many claim they like riding, but I know that they ain't.
Right or right.
I go hard in the paint, yeah, homie, I'm a saint.
Right or right.
Many claim they like riding, but I know that they ain't. They see the red and they call me a devil, but mind the treble, let me level with you. I used to idolize rappers that paint they face, but now I rock the blood of Christ ever since I've been saved by grace.
Well, for those tuning in now and then those tuning in the morning, welcome. I hope you guys always enjoy that intro as much as I do. It's Jay Payne, a friend of mine who is a rapper. Dr. Khalil, it was funny to see Graham Oppie's face when he first heard my intro when him and Mullins were on.
Yeah, I'm sure they don't. These philosophers are they don't hear much rap today. So,
although Ryan Mullins, to be honest, is a metal fan. Interesting fact.
it must be good distraction for the mind when you're just buried in arguments and syllogisms. You have to let loose, I guess.
That's true. I always wondered if I need to ask Ryan this: if when he's in an argument at home, if he ever forms a logical syllogism to get himself out of that.
Yep, I suspect it would not be that effective.
All right, guys. Well, for those interested in tonight's discussion, we're going to be talking about Tawhid. And ask Dr. Khalil a few questions. He's going to present some slides, give us kind of a good baseline overview on it. For those also interested in checking out his channel, the link is in. If you go to my YouTube channel and then you slide down, it gets the recommended channels. His should be like the third or fourth down on the list. Dr. Khalil, so you and I have been talking on and off about this, and I thought it was interesting because Tawhid is simply there is nothing like God, his uniqueness. But then I started learning different things like hands and face and different features and the different perspectives from different groups within Islam. So maybe that would be an interesting place to start.
Sure, yeah. So thanks for inviting me, and it's good that you sort of making the effort to look deeper into this. Tawheed is a term that obviously is thrown around a lot today, especially in contemporary Muslim dawah efforts, right? Everybody's talking about Tawheed. And like any doctrine in any religion, it has a contested history in the sense that Muslims for 1400 years have debated among themselves and struggled themselves to figure out what does Tawheed actually mean? What does it entail? What does it mean to say God is one? The word Tawheed actually is the verbal noun, okay, of the infinitive verb in Arabic, which is to make something one. Wahada. So Tawheed is like the noun form of that. It literally means making something one. You could also translate the word Tawheed as unifying, to unify something. So already, Tawheed is not really a thing, right? It's an action that is performed or that is accomplished by a subject. And that already, would raise some questions because what is it that we are unifying or making one? Are we making God, into something that's one? So one would have to be careful on how you understand the term. But over history, from a theological perspective, Muslims have understood Tawheed to mean the assertion, the belief that God is one. So obviously, one is not taking the verb literally. You're not making God one. God is already one. So Tawheed is really to assert, to testify that God is one. And the related word in Arabic is wahid, which means one, in the sense of numerical one or any other kinds of one. So there has actually been a big debate over Muslim history And you've probably heard, parts of the debate happening. Maybe you've been on Clubhouse or Twitter, and you see a back and forth. And despite the way things are portrayed today over Muslim history, there have been numerous interpretations of what exactly Tawhid entails. What does it mean that God is one? God is one, but in what sense? In what respect? Is God one in one respect, but many in other respects? For example, that's a question, and one may answer yes or no to that. Or is God one in every respect? That's another interpretation. So I'm going to share my screen here, and let's see here. And I've sort of just tried to make a conceptual map of some, not all, okay, but a handful of perspectives on Tawhid that we find, basically in the classical period. And the further you go in Muslim history, you'll get even more perspectives than what you're looking at. But broadly speaking, I would categorize the approaches to Tawhid, at least in a certain period of Islamic thought, in three categories. One we could call kalam. The second we could call hikmah, which is on the other side. And the third we would call Sufi. So kalam would be the theological tradition, which for the most part is Sunni. Hikmah would be the philosophical tradition, which is Shia and Sunni, actually. And Sufism would be the mystical tradition, which is also Shia and Sunni. And these are not hard categories. So at some point, you will get one or more of these perspectives merged. We can talk about, after the year 1200, we can talk about a sort of philosophical kalam. We could also talk about a mystical philosophy. We could even talk about mystically oriented kalam, mystically oriented theology. So these are just sort of some basic categories. And if you look, and we can go through this, but under each category, under kalam, you have at least 4 different perspectives, within Sunni Islam. The Mu'tazili, of course, were considered heretics eventually, but at one time they were part of Sunni Islam. And even in the mystical tradition, although I've highlighted one major thinker, Ibn Arabi, you will find other mystical concepts of Tawhid before him and after him. And in the hikmah or philosophical tradition, you will find different forms of that philosophical approach to Tawhid. So you can see here, like the first bullet says one God. So yeah, everybody believes in one God. But if you keep reading after that first bullet, things start to diverge. And one major factor in why you have different approaches to Tawhid, different interpretations of Tawhid, is that you have different methodologies. So if you look all the way on the left side of the screen here, under the Hanbali, and just to be fair, many Hanbalis will say that they are not kalam, but I've just put them under here for convenience. The Hanbalis, their approach to scripture, to revelation, their hermeneutic, their sort of interpretive toolbox, they will basically, when it comes to descriptions of God, they will affirm all descriptions of God found in the Quran and the Sunnah. They will affirm it literally. Okay, in other words, they will not do like metaphorical interpretations of theological language in the scriptures. They will never admit to doing that sort of metaphorical readings. So they will interpret, you could say, according to the surface meaning. But they will also say that we interpret everything amodally. So, for example, if you see Quran verses or hadith that talk about God's hand or God's 2 hands, which you definitely find in Muslim tradition, the Hanbalis will affirm that yes, indeed, God really has 2 hands. but they will add a qualification. They will say, God has two hands. However, there is no likeness between God's hands and anything created, and there is no common modality. There is no common howness between God's two hands and, our hands or the hands of a clock or whatever it is. So they are making a literal affirmation of whatever the scripture says about God, whether it's two hands, whether it's God's face, whether it's God descending every night to the lowest heaven. They won't turn that into a metaphor, but they will add these sort of negations. So some people have called the Hanbali view a transcendent anthropomorphism or an amodal anthropomorphism. That's what some scholars have sort of said. And that's because in their approach, you could say that the literal surface meaning of scripture rules over the intellect. Okay, for them, the Hanbalis will put scripture before intellectual considerations, before logic, in a sense, right? Now, if we look at other approaches, and again, you're looking at the second bullet on the chart on this diagram here. If you look at other approaches, in the Sunni side, the Asharis, the Maturidis, they will try to reconcile the scripture with what the intellect knows. They will sort of use intellect at the beginning as a tool to validate the truth of God and scripture, but then when they read scripture, they will sort of put intellect and scripture on the same level. And in some cases, they'll choose to do some amodal affirmation, i.e. God's hand or God's feet. They may do an amodal affirmation. And in other cases, though, the Asharis and Maturidis will do metaphorical interpretation of scripture. So later Asharis, later Maturidis and Asharis, they would have no problem saying that the two hands of God mentioned in a verse, that God created Adam with his two hands. They will have no problem like reading that metaphorically, the later Asharis, Maturidis. So that's because they trust the intellect much more than the Hanbalis. So that's a different hermeneutics, right? If you go to the Mu'tazilis, these are not the best summaries by me, but I'm trying to keep it simple for you. If you go to the Mu'tazilis, they will interpret the Quran and the Sunnah through the intellect, which means for them, the intellect, logic, will be a filter over what interpretations can really be possible. And because the Mu'tazilis do that, they will interpret any type of mention of God's hands, God's face, God's feet. They'll interpret all of it metaphorically because they trust the intellect even more than the Hanbalis and the Asharis and Maturidis. And as you go over to the other side, you'll find that the philosophers, whether it's the Falsafa or the Ismailis, they have that same confidence in the intellect, that they will establish a metaphysics through reason alone, using the laws of logic, and then the entire interpretation of the Quran must be consistent with what is established through logic. So that's how the philosophers and the Ismailis will read the Quran. The mystical tradition is a little bit different. They do believe in a certain kind of intellect that's good, but the mystics also believe in another type of faculty called imagination, which is more like a sort of mystical sense of intuition. So the mystics will add this other faculty, and that lets them develop some different interpretations than the others. So that's bullet point number 2, the hermeneutic, right? How you interpret the sources of Islam. And when you actually apply those methodologies, you end up, and if this is like bullet point 3, 4, you then end up with different theologies, right? So on the side of Kalam, they generally believe, and if you can sort of look at it, they believe that God has real distinct qualities that are part of him or within him. So for many in Kalam, God's knowledge is a real quality, it's a real entity in God, and God's power is another real quality within God. And God's knowledge and power cannot be identified with one another, according to the Hanbali, the Ashari, and the Maturidi on the side of the Kalam here, right? So they will talk about a multiplicity of real attributes. The Arabic term would be sifat. The Kalam theologians will talk about a multiplicity of real attributes, real sifat within God that are different from each other and different from God's self or God's essence. And that's an important point, because Tawhid, for Hanbalis, Asharis, and Maturidis, Tawhid is not an absolute unity. It's rather a complex unity, or you could say a unity that is inclusive of multiplicity, when you believe in multiple real attributes of God. So you would say that God's power is different from God's knowledge, which is different from God's life, which is different from God's speech, which is different from his wisdom, different from his hearing, different from his seeing, and so on. So you have a multiplicity of eternal entitative attributes in
So,
the Hanbali Ashari Maturidi views.
so
Yeah.
they would reject like divine simplicity in these groups.
Yes. The Hanbali, Ashari, and Maturidi would reject divine simplicity for that reason. You could call them complex theists, complex theism. And now you may find a few exceptions. Okay, if you go further down past 1200, you will find, a few Asharis and a few Maturidis who they may believe in divine simplicity, but overall, they don't, I would say. There's exceptions to everything, of course. Some might say, again, I don't know how many believe in this, but you may find a view among Asharis or Maturidis that say the multiplicity of divine attributes is only conceptual, it's only within the mind. You may find such views. It is claimed that certain Asharis, like E.G., for example, believe this. I think it's debated, though. So that's what you have on the Kalam side. Now, the exception to this, of course, is this group known as the Mu'tazili, right? The Mu'tazili do believe in divine simplicity. So they would say God does have attributes, but they are identical to him. The Mu'tazilis would say this. And the Mu'tazilis further believe that God acts in time. So they think God creates and he makes things in time, the Mu'tazili. So you could say they believe in divine simplicity, but they believe in temporal divine actions, the Mu'tazili group. Now, once we shift over outside of the Kalam tradition into the Hikmah tradition, philosophy, and the Sufi tradition, both of these traditions, the Sufis and the Hukama, the philosophers, whether they are in the Avicennan or the Ismaili tradition, everybody on this side believes in divine simplicity. And I would say they believe in very strong divine simplicity. So the earliest sort of type of divine simplicity, you're getting it from people like Al-Farabi, and then as well as the Ismailis. So they would straight up say that God is like this absolute simple reality. There are no parts in God of any kind. There are no actual entitative attributes within God. And of course, the reason they gave for that, they gave two reasons. The first, of course, was scriptural. They believe that when the Quran says God is one, it just means God is one. It does not mean God is one in one sense and multiple in another sense. So the reason for divine simplicity in the Islamic tradition, it was scriptural. You have several verses that say, your God is one God. It uses the term wahid. And then there's, of course, Surat al-Ikhlas, Kul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, which is often cited to convey the idea that God is one, without any internal multiplicity. And furthermore, though, there were rational arguments given by, even the Sufis would give these arguments, but the Sufis and the philosophers would give rational arguments on why God has no internal plurality in any sense. And the most sort of well-known summary argument would be that if there is internal plurality within God, i.e., you can really distinguish one divine attribute from another, from God's self, then this is a form of parthood, right? That God actually is comprised of multiple aspects. You don't have to call them parts, but you could call them anything. God is comprised of multiple aspects that are really distinguishable. And that means God is a complexity, a conglomerate of entitative aspects. And then by definition, God would depend on those multiple aspects. So that was their rational argument. They said, well, if God depends on something that's not identical to him, then that would make God a creation. That would make God a created being. God would no longer be the necessary independent reality. So they gave this rational argument as well for divine simplicity. And there's further ways to unpack that. So you have, again, apart from the Mu'tazilis, who are sort of like a middleman group, the Sunni Kalam tradition, Hanbalis included, rejects divine simplicity. The mystical Sufi and the philosophical Hikmah traditions fully affirm divine simplicity. So that would be sort of like your third bullet point. One thing I could add is on the Sufi side, in the tradition of Ibn Arabi, they would actually say that God is absolute being. God is absolute reality. Whereas on the philosophical side, the term they tend to use is God is necessary being. In Arabic, wajib al-wujud bi dhatihi. God is the necessary in itself. So you do have some difference in ontology, but generally the divine simplicity is maintained on the mystical and the philosophical sides. So let me pause there. Did you have any questions about those distinctions?
Yeah, I'm recognizing the Sufi position sounds very similar to the Jewish mystical position, as in using like imagination within some of the. But they take it a step further, like they can kind of reinterpret their religion through the rabbinical tradition. I've heard two. Let me see. We're talking about parts, but then I've heard that instead of them saying parts for the Kalam side, they would answer that it would be attributes, and that would be their response. What do you feel is the difference between somebody saying part or attribute?
Well, definitely, if you read any Kalam text, okay, in the early part of a Kalam text, they will say that God is not munkasim, i.e., God is not divided, and God is not murakab, God is not composite. They will say that. However, at the same time, the Kalam tradition, Mu'tazilis accepted, they will say that there are truly distinct attributes within God. So, although they would never use the term part, juz, in sort of modern English, in the philosophy of religion, what they call attributes will register as parts of some kind. You can say aspects, but even if you just keep using the term attribute, what ends up happening is that all the true statements about God is knowing, God is living, their texts say, the Kalam texts say, God is knowing through an eternal knowledge. God is powerful through an eternal power. And if you ask them, okay, can God be knowing through power? They'll say no. They'll reject that. So you basically have in the Kalam tradition, although they never use the term part, they still affirm these real distinctions within God. So
Mhm.
we
Because they
we
would
could use
say,
any other term; it wouldn't change the fact.
like God's knowledge is an attribute. They might say God's love is an attribute. But then if you say God's hand or yod is an attribute, but they don't have any explaining as to what the hand is, but you can explain what love is.
Yeah, so
Does
that's a whole other issue. So if we go to the Hanbali side of this, right? So you have scripture that at the outward meaning of language says God has hands. Now the question is, what do you do with that? So here are the different sort of answers. The Basically the Mutazilis will say that this is a metaphorical term, and that the Arabic language, even in the English language, say, "Give me a hand." Did you have a hand in this? Right? It's in your hands. So the word hand can and has always been used metaphorically in language, in the Arabic language too. Hand could mean help, right? It could mean power, it could mean favor. So the Mutazili solution is to simply say that God's two hands and all such expressions of body parts, that this is just metaphor for these other attributes or just for a particular action of God. Okay, so that's one approach, which is really the easiest approach to take. The Hukama, the philosophical tradition, will do something similar. Now, if you are looking at more traditionally minded Sunnis, they'll approach it differently. So the Hanbali approach will reject the metaphorical interpretation of most of these affirmations in the scripture. Okay, so they will say hand does not mean power, yad does not mean power. Stop changing the meaning. That's what they'll say first. Now, what then will they do with it? In the Hanbali tradition, there were three sort of options that one could take. Okay, and you find all three. The first is to actually say that God's yad means a hand that is like our hands. And this soon became heresy, but at one point in Muslim history, there were, proto Hanbalis who believed this. There's even some evidence that even the Umayyad caliphs encouraged this type of, divine embodiment thinking. So that belief was there. That God's face, hands, they are sort of like human ones. They have the same shape, for example. We have one Muslim exegete named Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, the author of one of the earliest tafsirs that we have extant. And Muqatil ibn Sulaiman did believe that God had a face and hands and legs, and he had sandals and all this stuff, and that it did have an anthropoid form of some kind. Like, he did believe this. Now, nobody really accepted this as orthodox, but it was there. So that's one option, to affirm likeness between God's hands and human hands. Most rejected this. So then now you have two more options. The second option is to say that the word yad or yadain, two yads, this does literally mean hand. However, God's hands have a modality that is utterly different than creaturely modality. Okay, so that would be to say God does have hands and face and feet and fingers. This is all found in hadiths, by the way. God is established upon the throne. However, this is all amodal. So either like there's no common modality between God's hands, God's establishment, God's face, God's fingers, and what we find in creation. And that approach is called denying the modality. It's in Arabic tafwid al-kayf, denying the modality, but affirming ithbat, affirming the outward meaning, the apparent meaning of the words. Okay, so they affirm that yad means hand, but they deny the modality of between God's hand and created hands. Can that position be critiqued? Yes. Many would say that this does not really solve the problem. It's just sort of an incoherent type statement. Because, like, what is an amodal, non-physical hand then? Like, what does that even mean, right? It seems unintelligible. So that position is there, but not all the Hanbalis followed it. So some other Hanbalis came and they went further. They said that yad does not mean hand. It just does not mean hand. They would say, we know that God is unlike anything because the Quran tells us that. So they would say that whenever the Quran or the Hadith uses terms like yad or wajh or kidam, which is foot, or what have you, asba, whatever it is, fingers, they would say that because these are used for God, we already know a priori that God does not have these things. So these terms must have a completely different meaning. So yad means something other than hand, they would say, but they don't know what it is. So that's called tafwid al-mahna, which means sort of delegating the meaning of this back to God. They would sort of say that God alone knows what the expression, yadain, two hands, means in the Quran and the Hadith. God knows it, we don't know it. So they would say that we're only going to affirm the wording, right? So they'll affirm the wording, wajullah, face of God. They won't, if they're true to their principle, they won't even translate yad as hand. They'll just say yad, and they'll be like, we don't know what it means. What they will affirm about yad is they'll say yad is a real attribute of God, but they don't know what the attribute is. Like, they don't know what it's supposed to be. So those are like the three Hanbali options. In the other Kalam traditions, Ash'ari and Maturidi, you will find some of that third meaning, reassigning, delegating the meaning back to God. Some Ash'aris, Maturidis do that, but the more recent ones will also say it's a metaphor. So yad means hand, but hand here is a metaphor, so then there's no problem. So that's what you find. And today there's sort of an internal debate, even if you go on Twitter, where people who claim to be part of the Hanbali tradition, they call themselves Salafis or they call themselves Atharis, but they're all sort of branded in the Hanbali tradition, and they themselves right now are debating. You'll see it on Twitter. There's a debate over whether yad does mean hand and it's just an amodal hand, or whether yad means something completely different and only God knows it. So you'll see a debate between those positions. In both cases, though, there's going to be a sense of I don't know, right? You either don't know what it is, or you know what it is, but you don't know the mode. So there's an I don't know admission of ignorance in both cases.
No, definitely. I appreciate you answering that. And for those watching, in about 11 minutes, I'm going to ask some of your questions in the live chat to Dr. Khalil. There is a super chat option, but please don't use that for questions. That's just if you want to support the channel. Ask your questions in the main chat. I will do my best to get as many of those into him in the 15 minutes that we'll have at that point. Let me see. And so then we're looking at the more, because you've got theological, mystical, philosophical, and the philosophical seems to be more tied into divine simplicity, which I've just recently adopted myself.
Oh, well, congratulations.
I fought it for a while. I think it's the only way I can reconcile my Trinity, as a side note.
Well, if I may ask this
Go
before we
on.
get to Q&A, how do you obviously divine simplicity has been very strong in the Christian tradition. Historically, most of the great church fathers affirm it. Even the Orthodox, you could argue, affirm
Mhm.
some version of divine simplicity, maybe a weaker one. But how do you understand the Trinity and divine simplicity? It seems to me that the Trinity, just by definition, is a real distinction within God. But of course, I know people
Mhm.
have different solutions to the question.
No, I mean, that's a great question. I think that within the divine nature, that would be like pure action. Um, and I haven't fleshed out fully because there's like three different views of that I'm aware of that I could kind of land on in divine simplicity. In a nutshell, I don't believe that God has parts, so it's reconciling that. But then we do have, like you were saying, within the Trinity, Christ does have a human nature, which does bring some other potential metaphysical commitments when we go to the incarnation. If somebody had to pin me down on what model of the Trinity would you defend in a philosophical discussion, I would either defend partialism or I would defend relative identity Trinitarianism. But my scriptural defense, theologically speaking, is going to probably line up pretty close with orthodoxy. Although, when it comes to like the filioque, I don't really have a position on whether or not it has to be proceeding from the Father, the Spirit, or so the Spirit proceeding from the Father, or if the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Um, I think that kind of sums it up.
I would recommend there's a book by Keith Ward.
I'll write that down.
Yeah, it's called I don't want to misstate
I'm
it.
always interested in looking for new books.
It's called Christ and the Cosmos, a reformulation of Trinitarian doctrine. I read it as part of I did an independent study when I was
Mhm.
a grad student at Harvard. I did an independent study with a Catholic priest slash professor
Mhm.
of comparative theology. Basically, I wanted to learn how to do theology in contemporary setting from a comparative perspective. So I got to study with like the leading comparative theologian for a semester, just me and him.
Mhm.
And he told me to read this book, and I read the book, and it was quite something. It's both like an education on all the different Trinity formulations that are
Mhm.
current today. There's like 30 chapters in this book. Like
Mhm.
it's a normal book length, but it's very divided. So he goes through like every major Trinity doctrine on offer
Mhm.
today. But what he also does is he gives his own version of Trinity. So what I can do is I'll just put this window on my share here. So
Yeah,
this
then
is just a
people can see
Google
the
book.
front.
Yeah, so I've read the book. It's pretty good. I say this as a Muslim. It's a very enjoyable read, and he's doing what you would call historical work. He's reporting past views of the Trinity, but
Mhm.
he's also doing what you call constructive theology, i.e., he's going to give his own notion of the Trinity and the incarnation. And without ruining the story, I could say that as a Muslim uh, philosophical Neoplatonist myself, there's a lot in his reformulation that I could agree with because he actually sort of revises certain Christian understandings that bring it much closer to certain forms of esoteric and mystical Islam. I'm not even sure whether he's aware of how closer it came, but it is. So, if
Yeah.
anything,
Mhm.
even if one reads it and doesn't like it, the book itself would help the conversation between Muslims and Christians today.
Yeah, I'll definitely take a look. I've read a few that are very good, like Dale Tuggy's got a couple of good books out on it. A Unitarian Christian. I've had him on the channel. Naturally, of course, I disagree with his conclusion, but then there's philosophical essays on the Trinity. Now, I would recommend to actually look at the book that Dr. Khalil recommended, or Dale Tuggy's first. The Philosophical Essays of the Trinity book is a couple $100, so it's not something that you can probably go just pick up at the library. But if you know somebody or a pastor friend who has it, definitely take a read for it, or send me a message or an email, because I can actually send that information back out to you guys. The email is in the About section of the channel.
All right. Well, I don't know. Do you want to look at the questions if we have any?
Yep, going to. Sometimes this the screen freezes on me, but I did see a few. This is kind of an interesting one. Are the attributes self-sustaining, i.e., they are also eternal?
Okay. Yes. Good question. So, for those schools who believe in real attributes, namely Hanbalis, Asharis, Maturides, there are some attributes that are eternal. Okay, they call them essential attributes. There's disagreement sometimes over like how many there are and what they are, but they every school of the attributionists, they all believe in some number of eternal attributes. Okay. They also believe, some of them believe that certain attributes are temporal. In other words, they're just what you call action attributes. A good example of this, God's knowledge, God's power, God's will, God's life, these are examples of eternal attributes. To put it in Christian language, you could say they're always actualized, right? God's knowledge is always actualized. There isn't some moment where, God's not sort of knowing something, right? So you could think of the eternal attributes as they're always actualized. But there are other attributes that some, not all, but that some of the attributionists would say are not always actualized. So God's act of providing. So like one of God's names in the Quran is the provider. But is God always providing? Some of the attributionists will say no, he only does the act of providing, at certain times. So providing would be an action attribute that's temporal for some schools. Some schools, the Maturides, tend to believe, as far as I know, that even the action attributes are eternal. The Maturides would say this. So they would say something like God is eternally knowing, living, powerful, and God is eternally providing and eternally creating. So they would say all the attributes are actual, but the Asharis, many of the Asharis would say that providing, rewarding, creating, these are temporal actions. They're not eternal attributes. The Hanbalis are sort of less clear on some of this stuff. I think you'd find a divide maybe among the Hanbalis of sort of certain things that are happening at a certain time and other attributes that are always, and eternal. So that's the question. That's just to answer the eternal part of it, right? But the person had another, it was sort of two questions in one. Are the attributes self-sustaining? Now that's a different question, whether they're eternal or not. And there are different answers to this. Are they self-sustaining? So I have not seen much discussion on that particular question. Are the attributes self-sustaining? I don't imagine many would say yes to that question, because if each attribute is self-sustaining, it sort of sounds like each attribute is sort of like a god in itself or something. But this is not really talked about in the Kalam tradition, at least in the classical Kalam. Maybe in the later period, somebody did go through this clearly. I think there might be a creedal text or commentary or something on a creed that may get into the question, are the attributes self-sustaining or are they sustained by something else? It's not something that's talked much about, though. But all I wanted to say is that the question is, are the attributes eternal, is a different question from whether they're self-sustaining, because something can be eternal but still sustained by a cause external to it. All right, so there was that. Let me see. I'm just scrolling through here. Do any of these? Yeah.
This was kind of I liked how he ended it, kind of funny. It says,
Yeah.
do any of these schools believe hand means hand, or forget this question, but the first one was handy?
Yeah.
I
Yes,
appreciate that humor.
I think we covered it a bit. There's a position among the Hanbalis, the what known as Tawhid al-Kaif, which would say hand means hand, yad means hand. God does have hands, but he has them amodally, in Arabic, bila kaif. So that's what you'll find. And now, whether that's a plausible reading, there'll be debate about that. So, the Hanbalis who take the view certainly think that's a completely fine reading to have. God has hands without asking how. God is above the throne without asking how. God has fingers, without asking how. Another phrase you'll hear from them is, God has two hands, God has fingers, God has eyes, in a way that befits his majesty. In a mode that befits his majesty. You'll hear things like this. So, yes, you do have that position. But that overall, this idea that God really has hands, but he has it in a way that befits his majesty, this is not a majority position among Muslims. I have to stress this. Even if you look at what I have here, the Hanbalis overall, they're not the majority. They're just a segment, right? The majority of Muslims over history, in terms of like what they believe theologically, would be Ashari, Maturidi, Mu'tazili influenced, Sufi influenced, and philosophical. Like if you like piled the majority of Muslims would not fall under this Hanbali category over history. So this is just to tell you that, for those who engage in polemics, right, against Islam, and people do that, you want to make sure that you're not just taking a position of one creedal school and then saying, okay, this is Islam now. Right? You'd want to sort of be aware of all these different positions. And I have a video on my YouTube channel, 3 hours, where I go through all of these. I spend like 30 minutes or something on all of these different positions with visuals and so on.
And the link to Dr. Khalil's channel can be found in my suggested YouTube channels, but also after the video is done, it processes. I'll go back, find the video, and I will share it out later on YouTube. So if you're subscribed to the channel, you should get that in the community posts. This next question you kind of touched on a little bit, that some of the other groups do adopt a divine simplicity in some ways, but not always. And his was, don't Metazides believe, I butchered that word, believe in divine simplicity?
Yes, they do. They do. And I did say that they do. They believe in divine simplicity. The Mu'tazilis as a group, as a school, don't exist anymore. However, their approach and many of their doctrines survived in Shi'ism, in Zaydi Shi'ism, and Twelver Shi'ism. So you still have Mu'tazili oriented theology today. It's still being done. They just don't call it Mu'tazili. They would call it Shi'i. And they do believe in divine simplicity. But what they have in common with the other Kalam schools is they believe God's actions are temporal. The Mu'tazilis believe this. Whereas on the other side, if you look at the Sufi mystical and the hikmati philosophical schools of Islam, They believe in divine simplicity, but they believe in eternal creation. Right? So for the Sufis and the philosophers, God's creative act is eternal. It's not something that happened at a certain time. And that's a big divide between what we call kalam and everything else. Like, is the divine creative act, an act in time, or is it eternal? So that's what would really distinguish the Mu'tazilis from the other divine simplicists, if we can call them that, in Islam.
Gotcha. And the next question: what are some of the differences between Ismaili and, I'm going to butcher this last word, Fala? Maybe you can help me with that pronunciation.
You can try. Just say it as it's written.
Fala Sophie?
No, just say it as it's written in English. Like, pronounce the A like you would normally pronounce an A.
Fal Sophie? I'm just going to keep butchering this. This is my dyslexia coming.
Okay, so falsafa.
Oh, I would have never gotten that right, Dr. Khalil.
Yeah, falsafa. So basically, they have a lot in common, Ismailis and falsafa. There's a lot in common. The overall metaphysical framework is basically the same. Okay, we're talking about sort of hylomorphism, the idea of intellectual and spiritual substances. So that their underlying metaphysics is very similar. They started off different, but the Ismailis and the Falasifa seem to be reading the same source text. So they're both reading like the Arabic translations of Plotinus and the Arabic translations of Proclus. They're all reading this, and then they're very carefully adapting the terminology and concepts from Greek thought, but very, very carefully. So they're sort of harmonizing certain Greek teachings, Platinian teachings, with the Quran. So that's the method. The Ismailis, of course, believe that the filter, the ultimate sort of check that you would have to do with your theology is you would have to refer to the Imam, the infallible Imam of the time, who's a descendant of Muhammad that Ismailis believe has been divinely appointed through history, through a chain of succession, to be an infallible guide. So the Ismailis, they would sort of they would make sure whatever philosophical theology they do is consistent with the teachings of the Imam. The people of falsafa, or what we call the philosophers, the falasifa, they don't believe in a single infallible Imam. They have more confidence in just, philosophical reason. And what ends up in the falsafa tradition is, although they don't believe in an infallible Imam, you have certain great philosophers who become the paradigm for the whole tradition, and everybody refers back to them in some way, either to check or to comment on them. So Ibn Sina, in a sense, is the Imam of the philosophers, not in the sense that he's infallible, but he defines, the whole development of the falsafa tradition, Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. And it could be said in a crude way that like all Islamic philosophy after Ibn Sina is commentaries on Ibn Sina. He's sort of like the Aristotle of Islam. So you have a difference between them in method. But in terms of what they come out with, from as far as metaphysics is concerned, is very, very similar. And eventually, through certain individuals, Ismaili and Falsafa metaphysics will be harmonized. So somebody named Nasiruddin Tusi is a member of both traditions. He was an Ismaili and he is part of the Falsafa tradition. He mastered both and he harmonized them. So eventually you have a harmony. I would say that at the level of language, the Ismaili semantics about God is more apophatic than the Falsafa tradition. So the Falsafa tradition would, at the semantic level, they'll prefer to say things like, God's attributes are identical to God. Every attribute is identical to God's essence. They'll say things like this. Mutazlis would say this too. The Ismailis would sort of not use that language, because for Ismailis, everybody writing around the Ismailis believed in real attributes. So now when you use the word attribute, it means like a distinct entity. So the Ismailis would prefer to say that God transcends having attributes. So they're more negative in their language. They would say, no, he does not have attributes, and he doesn't have the privation of the attribute either, i.e., God doesn't have this distinct attribute of knowledge, right? Because that would make multiplicity within him. So God doesn't possess knowledge as an attribute, but at the same time, God does not have ignorance, which is to say he's not deprived of the ontological content of the attribute either. So that's more negative language that Ismailis would use. The Falsafa would use a more positive language. But then when you read Falsafa much more closely, you do see in certain texts of the philosophers, they get very negative too in the language. So Ibn Sina will say things like this. There's certain passages of Ibn Sina where he'll admit that, God truly is above and beyond in the sense of transcendence, all these sort of positive attributes and things like this. So I would say that they're not the same, but they do have a lot in common, the Ismaili and the Falsafa tradition.
Alrighty, and then this will be the last question. I think we'll end up missing a few, but
well, I don't mind. I don't mind going
okay.
like 5-10 minutes more, to get all these. So.
Oh, perfect. So all the questions that are in there now, these will be the ones we take, but we won't take any more after that, because I do got to put my kids to bed soon. Let me go to this one. Why do the Ash'aris believe that Allah is transcendent yet can be seen with eyes in the next life? Is this contradictory?
That's a good question. It's probably something that an Ash'ari should answer instead of me, because I'm not Ash'ari. But from what I've recalled reading and what I've heard from other Ash'aris, they would say that the eyes that you see God with in the next life are not going to be these fleshy eyes anyway. They would say it's some sort of it's a different type of eyes, eyes of the hereafter. So they would never say that it's these physical eyes or physical vision that sees God. Again, this is what an Ash'ari himself told me. I don't have a more specific answer because I would have to go and find the text where this is discussed, but most likely they would affirm the vision like amodally, and they might say, as I mentioned, that it's not with fleshy eyes.
Gotcha. And then the next question is, thanks, Doctor. What is your position on this? What are the philosophical problems with Hanabali are avoiding when they say, and this is another word I'm not going to pronounce, Dr. Khalil.
Yeah, that don't worry about that. That's it's not spelt right, so you cannot be blamed. Okay, so what is your own position on this? I am a Shia Ismaili Muslim, so I follow the Ismaili philosophical perspective on Tawhid. I follow it out of my own free will. In the Ismaili community, we're not actually indoctrinated into the details of this stuff. Everybody's sort of encouraged to sort of do their own research and look at all these things. So I sort of came to the Ismaili philosophical position on my own because I thought it was the most convincing one. And I am generally amenable to the Tawhid in Falsafa because it's so similar to the Ismaili view. And I'm of the position that the differences between the Ismaili and the Falsafa views on Tawhid is really at the semantic level. I think in terms of ontology, it's very, very close. I don't see a real conflict in terms of the ontology, but at the level of semantics, the language usage is different between the Ismaili and the Falsafa formulations, and I'm comfortable sort of dealing in both. And of course, as some people may know, in about a month's time, there will be a public debate between myself and Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, where I will be defending this broadly hikmah, falsafa, Ismaili view of Tawhid. So that's sort of where I come from. And again, I hold the view because I am intellectually convinced of the hikmah, falsafa, Ismaili paradigm. I find that the most intellectually compelling. And I acknowledge other people don't, and that's okay. As to the second part of the question, what are the philosophical problems that the Hanbali are avoiding when they say bila kaif? I think the thing to mention here is that while some people may see the bila kaif as a bad thing, the Hanbalis do not see it as a bad thing, right? The Hanbalis see the bila kaif almost as a virtue. I mean, they do bila kaif as a badge of honor, because for the Hanbalis, there is a commitment that to be true Muslims in their view, and to be true to truly submit to God's message in their view, is to literally affirm everything that it says without doing metaphorical interpretation. So because they have sort of closed the path, they've closed the door of metaphorical readings. Again, there are some exceptions to this. Sometimes they actually do metaphorical readings, but they don't admit it. But generally, because they've closed the door to metaphorical readings, they have to add bila kaif. Otherwise, they would literally be affirming God is like a human, which they don't want to do. So for them, bila kaif is sort of necessary. You have to do it. Now, are there philosophical problems with that? I think many would argue there are, but that's a whole other debate, which we don't need to get into now.
This one could be almost a whole discussion in itself. This next question. I have an odd question because of the long discussion where I found Wahhabis believe the throne is eternal. What is the dividing line between opinion and heresy in Islam? Are all these positions harmonious?
Okay, so firstly, the positions on the slide are not harmonious, right? They're not. These are mutually conflicting views of Tawhid. Totally mutually conflicting views. So these are not harmonious because these are all interpretations that come from specific communities or schools of thought. And each school of thought, if you go to bullet point number 2, each school of thought has different methodology, a different hermeneutics. So no, these are not harmonious. And what we need to be aware of, whether you're Muslim or not, is that Islam is not one thing. It's actually not one belief system. Islam is really a set of competing belief systems, each one claiming to be true Islam. So when you ask about orthodoxy, I think the question mentioned heresy rather, but heresy implies orthodoxy, right? Heresy is the opposite of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is correct belief, and heresy would be, a deviation. So here's the thing. Each school has its own understanding of orthodoxy. There is actually no meta-orthodoxy that all of these 6 or 7 views are going to be subjected to. Rather, each view claims itself to be orthodox and everybody else as heterodox to some degree, believe it or not. Some groups are even more extreme. So most of these groups, if you ask them, they'll say that we are the true Islam, ours is the correct Tawhid, and the other Tawhids are misguided, right? Each group will say this. Or the other Tawhids are sort of partially misguided. That's what you'll hear. And that's what it was for some time. In the early period, it was very common for, each group to to declare the other one like utterly deviant. That was just common because these orthodoxies were still in formation. But recently, what has happened is a one group known as the Salafis, and I like to call them Wahhabis because their teaching goes back to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, who is a Najdi, i.e., certain region in Arabia, a Najdi preacher uh, who lived in the 1700s. He gave this totally new interpretation of the Hanbali Creed, which nobody before him had given. We don't have to go into the details, but it was an extremely intolerant and hostile belief system that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab came up with. And he basically said anyone who disagrees with his understanding of Tawhid is not a Muslim. That's what he did. So whether you're Shia or Sunni, if you don't agree with Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's understanding of Tawhid, he said, you're not a Muslim. Now, this, of course, was not just a theoretical or intellectual judgment. This had legal consequences. So the Wahhabi movement, as is well known, declared hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Arabia and in other places, declared them to be apostates, and subsequently sent in armies to kill, murder, slaughter, loot, and rape other Muslims. This is all documented in history. This happened in Arabia, in cities like Taif, for example. It happened in Iraq. The Wahhabi army went into Karbala. They invaded the city. They looted and destroyed, the shrines of Imam Hussein and others. They murdered tens of thousands of people in these conquests, and the justification that the Wahhabis gave for this mass murder was, these people don't follow our Tawhid, so now they're not Muslims, and they're not Jews or Christians either. They're people with no legal status, so they can be killed. So this is what the Wahhabis did, and although that form of Wahhabi movement has been reined in by the Saudi rulers. That ideology that Tawhid is this, and anyone who doesn't believe in our Tawhid is not a Muslim or is an idol worshiper, that's still here with us. And it just exists in a milder form, which is like what the modern Salafi movement and descendant spin-offs of that modern Salafi movement, which calls itself Athari, for example, and so on. So that is a very uncompromising, intolerant claim to orthodoxy, which obviously the rest of the Muslims don't agree with. And right now, if you go on Twitter, there is a back and forth going on between these Salafis. The Wahhabis call themselves Salafis now. So the Salafis and the rest of the Sunnis are debating right now. Like as we speak, you can watch that debate on various platforms. Now, the mainstream Sunnis, the group that we call Sunnis over history, they would be the Hanbalis, Asharis, and Maturidis. They, at some point, probably around the 1200s, they decided, the scholars of these groups decided that, okay, a Sunni is one of these three. So that was one sort of orthodoxy that formed. But then on the other side, you have these other orthodoxies, right? On the side of the Ismailis, the Sufis, and the philosophers, these are competing orthodoxies. So you don't have one orthodoxy. Someone said in the comment, I feel most Muslims consider Asharis, Maturidis to be orthodox and mainstream. Well, the Sunnis, that's a Sunni perspective on orthodoxy, right? The Shia have their own perspective on orthodoxy. So it's important, just like if you ask the Catholic Church who is Orthodox, they're not going to tell you that the Protestants are Orthodox. They won't even say that the capital O Orthodox Church is Orthodox. The Catholics will say that no, only we're Orthodox. And then the Orthodox Church will say, no, we're Orthodox, and the Catholics are deviants. So just like in Christianity, right, we admit that empirically there are multiple Christianities. Empirically, I'm not saying that they're all right, but empirically there are multiple Christianities. Empirically speaking, there are multiple Islams. There are many Islams. Each Islam claims to be the right one, and they have the right to make those claims. But for those on the outside, like yourself, James, and other Christians, it helps to have that nuance, right? Because if you're talking to a Shia Muslim or a Muslim Failsuf, a member of the Falsafa tradition, if you're talking to those people, imagine if you tell them, "Oh yeah, you guys are not Orthodox," and they say, "Why?" And you say, "Well, the Sunnis say these people are Orthodox." They're just going to be like, "What relevance does the Sunni view of Orthodoxy have on me? I'm not Sunni." And this happens on to me on Clubhouse a lot, where you have people projecting the orthodoxy of a group that I'm not part of, and then saying that, "Oh, you need to go defend these beliefs now." I see it happening all the time. So
There's one more pop-up question. I think it is probably, if you wouldn't mind, I think it is a good one. It kind of follows up on what you were addressing earlier. Can you elaborate more on these Wallaby armies, which invade, kill, and can't say that word because of YouTube. Sounds like revisionist history, but I may be wrong.
it's not revisionist history. This is actual history. It's been documented by contemporary sources. So let me give you an example. Okay, I can just pop something in the chat. I don't know how to do that. Let me see. Okay. I can do it. So, this is a blog post by an academic colleague of mine. He's a history professor at State University of New York, one of the campuses. And his name is Mohammed Balan. He's a trusted colleague. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago, and he wrote a very short article about this. So this is one of the examples of this Wahhabi mass slaughter that took place. And I've pasted it into the YouTube chat right now. And if you open that up, you will read two different sources that are contemporary or eyewitness accounts. So the first is from Rousseau, right, which is sort of a Western European source who was there. He saw this happen. And then the second report is from Uthman ibn Abdullah bin Bishr, who is writing from a Wahhabi perspective. All right. And
I'm not seeing the link in the chat. I'm thinking it's probably.
I think it's in the YouTube chat, not in the StreamYard, because I can't type in the StreamYard. It seems.
I gotcha. Can you just type hi real quick, and I'll give you just a wrench, and then it'll let you put the link. I forgot YouTube has that rule of thumb to prevent people from posting links in your chats. If you just type hi in the chat, I'll give you a wrench real quick, and you can post it.
Okay. We've done that.
Okay, you are now a moderator, so you can post that link for them.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so you'll see in this blog post by my friend Professor Balan, he has provided some sources on this. It's a very, very short post. And there's also a good book. It's called The Wahhabi Mission in Saudi Arabia by David Commons. He'll talk about it in there. And look, there's a quick way for anybody to fact check things. Frankly, just go into Google Books, okay? And you can type in like Wahhabi conquests and type in Karbala or Taif or something. And you will get like hits from books, and people, they'll talk about this. So there's multiple references to the conquest of Taif in 1803, Mecca and Medina in 1805. They just massacred everybody, and these are other Muslims. These are not, these are not like Jews and Christians, or these are other Muslims that the Wahhabis were slaughtering. This is a part of history that has been covered up because the Wahhabi movement has rebranded itself several times over the last 200 years. So today's Wahhabi movement, frankly, is a Care Bear version of the original one. Frankly, the original Wahhabi movement, the earliest one in the 1700s and early 1800s, it actually makes ISIS look pretty tame, to be honest.
So, guys, I'm not sure. The link's still not showing up in the chat. So, what I'm going to do is we're going to end the video in the next few minutes. I will put it in the link description right after we're done. I'll get it from Dr. Khalil, and it should show up there.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would just, even without my link, go to Google Books, type in Wahhabi conquests, type in Karbala, Taif, Mecca. You will read academic literature will come up, and go to the book, see the account in the book that comes up, and check the footnote, see what source are they using, and you will find that you have contemporaneous sources, sometimes eyewitness sources. It's often written by Wahhabis themselves, where they proudly report this. Just nobody seems to know about this. People find out about the sort of original violence of the Wahhabi movement like many years after they've become Salafi. In fact, you could watch the videos of Yasser Qadhi. Yasser Qadhi started out as a Wahhabi, and he was that for many years, and in the recent years he has disowned that movement, and he explains quite candidly why he left and what he how he learned about the atrocities that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and his successors committed against other Muslims. Right, their primary victims were Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. So it's not revisionist history based on what that person wrote in the chat. In a sense, I wish it were revisionist history. I wish that death and slaughter didn't happen, but it did. So that's just important to note that
it's good to cover that stuff, because I think sometimes people have a habit of trying to rewrite history in the opposite way, and then they'll say well, this didn't happen, or this group would never do this. But when you look at history, even when in Christianity, I think Calvin, one of the great theological minds, even had somebody executed. You can't pretend that, and by Calvin I mean where we get Calvinism from, in a manner of speaking, although we would say the Bible. But so you can't deny these things in history. And there's just some words that I remember. I think it was my third grade teachers told me, and then every teacher after that, is that if you forget the past or ignore it, you're in danger of potentially repeating it.
And the thing is that this type of violence, I mean, I've given the Wahhabi example, but you will find, if you just go back a few centuries, you will find Christian groups doing this too in Europe. There's a famous case of Munster, Germany. I'm probably not saying that correctly, but the Anabaptists, the radical Anabaptists, established a sort of sectarian government in Munster in the 1500s, and the city was ruled for a short amount of time, and the Anabaptists installed their law, and it was the type of rule that they had. From a contemporary perspective, it looks not very civilized in a sense. So you will find this in certain parts of the world by different religious groups doing this sort of thing. But the Wahhabi example is particularly noteworthy because contemporary Muslims and non-Muslims are just not aware of it, even though it's been written about by many scholars.
Oh, and Dr. Khalil, I want to thank you again for joining us. You were advertising earlier a debate coming up. You said in a month or 2 months.
Yeah, it'll be. We actually have a date, so it'll be announced soon officially. But it's going to be on March 27th, Sunday, noon Eastern time. And the title of the debate is Debating Tawhid, Islamic Philosophy versus Sunni Muslim Athari Creed. I'm representing Islamic philosophy, and Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, is representing the Sunni Athari Creed. So, two diametrically opposed perspectives on Tawhid, on the oneness of God. And you know, if you watch, you'll get to see us duke it out, I guess.
And this will be held on the Thought Adventure podcast.
Yes, it will be on the Thought Adventure podcast, and yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, it at least in the English language, it may be the first debate of its kind in the internet era. You know, like an intra-Muslim sort of debate, as opposed to, you know, Christian-Muslim debates, which seem to happen all the time.
I couldn't find any, to be honest, when I've been looking into Tawhid. A lot of the stuff is in Arabic, and even some of the literature that I would want to read to understand some different perspectives of it is still in Arabic. So that what you're saying makes complete sense.
Yeah, I tried to find some too, and I couldn't even find any English debates between, you know, different Muslim schools of thought. So I think it'll be an intellect. I mean, regardless of sort of whose side one is on, I think the debate itself would be an intellectual service to other Muslims, English speaking Muslims, as well as non-Muslims, because as you said, right, it's hard for a non-Muslim like yourself who speaks with Muslims to get a handle on this diversity. And a debate, you know, obviously providing that it's everybody behaves themselves, and I don't have any concerns about that. But a moderated debate is a good opportunity for people just to learn what the different positions are. Just like when I watch a Catholic debating a Protestant on the papacy, you know, even though I don't have a horse in the race, it's a learning experience.
Absolutely. All right. Well, once again, thank you, Dr. Khalil, for joining me. Guys, I'm going to hit the outro. I always get in trouble for not saying this. Click the bell or like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Please check out Dr. Khalil's channel. He's got hours and hours of academic material that you guys can soak in, including a more like a 3-hour more detailed version of what was kind of summed up in about 40 minutes here.
All right, thank you so much, James.
No problem.
I go hard in the paint.